Good afternoon. This is Briefing with the Chief. I'm your host, Patrick Jordan, here on KGRADB.com. That is KGRA Radio. We're here every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We broadcast on KGRA's Rumble channel, their Facebook page, and their Twitter feed. You can also find me at LASD Jordan on Twitter or X. Because I post a wide variety of things. I've been starting to drop in on some of the spaces too. Very interesting subjects going on Twitter. But anyways, check me out on Twitter because I do hit a lot of different subjects. I'm starting to get into the energy policy in California, which is lunacy in my mind. But that's probably the next biggest thing coming up. And our governor here, our governor here, they're looking to sign a bill to give unemployment to illegal immigrants who haven't worked. And to understand what I mean by that is it's unemployment insurance. So as you work, your employer pays in that pool in case you should have to get laid off, and then you get paid. But if you've never worked, you haven't paid in the pool. Makes absolutely no sense. But I'm focusing on those issues as well. I do generally focus on law enforcement issues, public policy issues related to criminal justice, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about charitable bail funds. But before I do that, I just want to remind you, you can find this show every Wednesday, like I said, on KJ's Rumble channel, their Twitter feed, and in their Facebook page. But you can also download the KJDB.com app and listen to the show live. And you can also go to KJ. If you can't listen live, you go to KJDB.com, Briefing with the Chief. Go to my show page. You're going to find the description of my show. You're going to find my bio. And at the bottom of the page are all the audio versions of my shows. So there's no reason why you can't binge with the Chief. And if you don't want to go to KJ's website, you can find us on Spotify. You can find us on iHeartRadio. You can find us on Spreaker. You can actually pull up your Amazon account and type in Briefing with the Chief, KJRA, and we come up under there. And you know what? It's all free. All of that is free. So there isn't any reason why you can't hear my opinion. Now, there's so many things. Before we bring on our guests, there's so many things in the news today that is just shocking to me. And in the very first one, I wanted to talk about the ABC. I don't really have an article on this, but the debate, the cheating in the debate, and somebody has put out an affidavit that's still got to be verified yet, but there seems to be some real evidence that ABC colluded with the Harris campaign to gain advantage in the debate. Now, I watched the debate and I saw that they checked Trump, and whenever they felt like he wasn't being 100% forthright, but they didn't do the same thing to Kamala Harris. And so, that was the first thing that concerned me. Now, I was a public speaker since high school, so I watched it based, and she was generally better prepared. Trump was speaking off the cuff, but Trump was talking about details. He was talking about his policies, and she was just trying to get under his skin. And it appears like ABC was part of it. That's what it looked like to me. It appears the independents are following Trump anyways, but I really want to know, did ABC further degrade the trust that they have with the public by cheating? And hopefully we'll get a little more information on that. I will follow that story, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that in the future. The other one is the second assassination attempt, and of course, it's quickly off the pages of Donald Trump. Some guy waited 12 hours outside of the Trump International Golf Course down there in Florida near Mar-a-Lago, laying in wait to shoot the president. And it's indicated on a lot of his social feeds or what he's on, the platforms he's on, that he's anti-Trump. And of course, immediately the media turns the narrative that it's Trump and JD Vance that are spewing the hate. If you've been listening to my show, I've always been kind of a lukewarm supporter of Trump because sometimes I don't like his shtick, but I like his policy and he supports law enforcement. So I voted for him twice and I'll vote for him a third time. But here's the deal. I've been watching the Democrats. They've been calling him a Russian agent since he got in the race in 2015, and they have never backed off. A Russian agent, threat to democracy. He's doing all these things wrong. And when three investigations proved, let's see, it was the Horowitz investigation, it was the Mueller investigation, it was and what was the last guy, Durham investigation, all said, no, this didn't happen. They censured Adam Schiff for lying to the American people, lying to Congress. And yet they still call him the liar, which is shocking to me. Anyway, so hopefully, I'm glad Trump is safe. I'm glad the Secret Service stopped that one. I don't see that the Democrats will back off on their language, or the left actually will back off their language. It's reprehensible. I know that a lot of people just don't like Trump, so they're ignoring this. But They're ignoring it to their peril because today it's Trump, tomorrow, and today it's law enforcement because we went through this where they vilified law enforcement for a long time, and we still do unreasonably and unfairly. And law enforcement officers are targeted, and nobody's calling out the left for their violent rhetoric and language. And I have a real problem with that. I have a problem when they do it to Trump. I have a problem with they do it with cops. I see the two are similar behavior, and people are getting hurt. Now, the other one I wanted to talk about, and we had a couple guys on the show from New York City's finest unfiltered, John and Eric, and they've been all over, and you can see their YouTube podcast at the bottom of the screen at the finest unfiltered. And they've been all over a scandal that's going on in New York City. It reaches all the way. The mayor's office is under 4 federal investigations. Many of the senior folks have had their phones and their computers taken by the Southern District in New York federal investigation, including the NYPD commissioner and many of his top associates. And they've been laying out the potential scam where, hey, it's a kind of a, you pay us and we'll make sure you get your permit. So pay to play at the highest levels, of the NYPD and New York City. Very troubling, very troubling. Now, for me, as somebody who studies politics, when you have a government, state, local, county, that are almost all one party, it opens the door for corruption. I just think that is part of it. I personally believe, when you degrade the punishment for crimes and you say that crimes that are on the books that you don't enforce, it invites people to commit crimes because there's no standard. It's a slippery slope. We have all these folks that commit crimes and are ignored by Alvin Bragg and other DAs around the country, these Soros-funded DAs. So what is wrong? Where is the line on what you can do and you can't do? And I think it just opens up this mindset that laws really don't mean anything. I really do believe that's part of what's going on there. Obviously, I've been watching this, and let's bring the commissioner. I think we have a headline. Here he is, Edward Caban. He hasn't been in that long, but it sounds like he has a twin brother, and there's been this scam that's been going on for a long time where they're kind of stiff-arm nightclubs to get money out of them to get permits. He's the guy that resigned, and I'm going to encourage you to go to Eric and John's YouTube page. They're on at five in the morning. 5 in the morning. They usually run for about 2 hours. 5 in the morning. That's New York time. I mean, I'm sorry, that's California time here. So it's 5 in the morning for me. So if you're on Pacific Standard Time, I guess that would be 8 in the morning for Eastern Standard Time, for a couple hours. And they've been talking about this, and you can go back and listen to their previous shows. I want to encourage you to listen to them to get up to speed. And I think once the scandal matures a little bit, I'll probably do a show just on the scandal in New York, because I check in with Chicago, I check in with Oakland, I check in with New York, I check in with some of the cities in Texas and see what's going on with a lot of these Soros-funded DAs, and I'm going to check in with these guys as this scandal develops a little bit more. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is these pagers blowing up in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah. It appears to be the work of the Israeli Mossad. So yesterday it was pagers, and it's like my understanding is Hezbollah had purchased like 5,000 pagers, and almost 3,000 of them blew up yesterday, or at least they had nearly 3,000 injured. Some of those were fatalities, some of those were very serious injuries, and it just sent shockwaves throughout Lebanon, southern Lebanon, in Beirut, and in Syria, because some of the Hezbollahs in Syria as well. And to me, it's like, well, one, it's a brilliant attack, because it's to get you to be in Hezbollah, they got to be able to talk, and so they give them a pager, which is, I always wonder what Motorola did with all these outdated pagers when cell phone came in. I guess they sent them all to the terrorists, but what they did is the terrorists realized, because a lot of their senior leaders were being taken out with cell phones, don't use cell phones anymore, and they made them all switch to beepers. So they provided the beepers, and somehow, probably the Israelis got into that supply pipeline and modified these pagers and put a little bit of explosives in there. A very crazy, but very successful attack. And today, they followed up with walkie-talkies are blown up. So Lebanon is rocked again by exploding devices, and Israel declared a new phase of war. So today, they started having other devices, not just walkie-talkies. Other electronic devices are blowing up. So this is a very long developed plan. If this is Israel, which it probably is, they obviously been working on this for probably a couple of years to plant these explosives. We saw the assassination in Iran where they had planted the explosives in the guest house where they killed the high-ranking figure. I think it was of, I'm not sure if it was Hamas or Hezbollah, but they had planted it months before, and they just waited patiently until the person they wanted to stayed there, and then they killed him. So that's what's going on. And why is that important to us here when we talk about public policy on Briefing with the Chief? We talk about terrorism in the United States. Is because we are seen as the great Satan by Iran. A lot of this terrorism is being pushed by Iran. Certainly Hezbollah is. Certainly Hamas is. And we have an open border. We've had some great guests on my show who talked about that open border and why that's a threat to us. I mean, finally, Director Wray, after October 7th, said there's a threat, and there's a threat in this country. Islamic extremists is a threat to our safety and to our country, and we've had a lot of people cross the border who clearly are probably connected with those organizations. Now, one of the reasons why I'm really angry about that, because I did anti-terrorism stuff for many years, is because I started talking about this when I was doing radio commentary 3 years ago. I said the Biden administration has focused almost exclusively on domestic terrorists and has ignored international terrorism. And we've seen what happened. We saw what happened in Gaza. The U.S. didn't know what was going on. And we've let all these people in our country, and I'm confident that our intelligence agencies do not have their thumb on the pulse of what's going on. And you heard that. You heard it from Sarah Adams and David Boone Benton when they were on talking. They were two CIA employees that now left that agency, and they came on and talked about their book, Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy. When they talked about the attack in Benghazi, they said, no, we have operatives in this country. They're dangerous. You heard it from Dr. John Sullivan, who's been on my show a couple of times. He said, yes, the open border is a problem. We can focus on more than one threat. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has been focused more on internal threats, what they say are internal threats, and not focused enough on these external threats. And he believes that we're under threat. Sir A.J. Lauterbach, a border sheriff, he came on the show, said the same thing. So they're all singing the tune here on Briefing with the Chief that we're under threat, and we can see that. And so when Israel starts attacking Hamas and Hezbollah, when you have harder targets, Israel's a hard target for those guys. Softer targets of the U.S. because we haven't been on our game when it relates to terrorism. I just think it's a challenge for us, and I think you guys need to pay attention because the administration right now is not doing a good enough job to keep us safe. I'm worried that we will be attacked in the next year or so. And I place that blame squarely on the Biden and the Harris administration. That's why the stuff going on in Lebanon and the stuff going on in Iran and the stuff going on in Israel is important. And we also, I almost forgot. We had Thomas Ellis on. He talked about how these anti-Semitic protests at college campuses and around the country started on October 8th, which would mean they were well funded and ready to go for when this attack was over with. And he can draw a direct line that funding is coming from Qatar. Absolutely. I did a show recently where we talked about the Media Resource Center, and they talked about Soros has funded some of this anti-Semitic protests in our country. So they're here, they're active. They're probably they are at least using spending money to ramp up these protests. There's no doubt in my mind that they're preparing to do something else. That's what worries me about this. That's why you need to pay attention to what's going on. That's why when these things happen overseas, it's important to us here in the U.S. And it's only a matter of time, in my opinion, based upon my years of fighting terrorism here in the United States and my connections with federal authorities when I was doing that. So, hey, enough on the news here. We when I was going through the academy, I was taught, you have to be flexible. And our guest, Jeff Clayton, could not make it. He got called to court. Now, that's happened to me before. Get called to court, your kid's going to do a baseball game that day, and boom, you're in court, right? Or, whatever it is. You got to go to some musical for your kids. Boom, you got to go to court. Well, Jeff Clayton, he got called to court. He's a lawyer. He was going to talk to us about charitable bond funds. But you know what? We got somebody that's going to pinch hit for Jeff. He's stepping in, and before I bring him on, I just want to throw one article up there. I think it's an article. It is from the Reporter, and it's from Indiana. Let's throw that headline up there, and I'll talk a little bit about this case, and it'll just be kind of a little tune up and warm up for our guest. Amanda, I think we're looking for the Reporter article. It is, there it is. It's charitable bail fund responsible for my son's death. And so this article came out just recently. I think it was September 2024 or 20? I can't read the date here, but it's about Dylan McGinnis. He was 24 years old. He was killed in 2021 by somebody who had been released from a bond fund. There he goes, December 9th, 2021 is the article. But he's also filed a lawsuit, and there's more recent articles that showed that this killer was sentenced and received 96 years. But his killer was a guy named Travis Lane, and he had previously arrested for narcotics possession, narcotics sales, fighting with the police. He had a lengthy record, and he was released by the Bail Project. This is one of those charitable bail funds, and the dad is suing that fund. But this article talks about how had they not supported this guy, he would have likely been in custody, and his son would be alive today. And that's not the only story, but that's what really got me interested in this subject, the charitable bail fund, and also one of our leading political candidates supported it. But before we get into all that, let's bring on our guest, Shane Rolf. He's the owner of Shane Bail Bondsman in Kansas. He's the executive vice president and founding member of the Kansas Bail Agents Association. And he's instrumental in passing and shaping bail laws in the state of Kansas for nearly 2 decades. Shane, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Chief. I appreciate the chance to pitch in for Jeff. Jeff knows this stuff probably better than I do, but I'll do my best to at least hit a double, maybe.
Well, you do have a podcast, so let's plug your podcast before we get into what's your podcast name and where can the folks find it?
It's called Bail in the Midwest, and it's available on all the audio podcasts. It is on YouTube. Unfortunately, it doesn't have its own page, so you just have to do the search Bail in the Midwest podcast, and it'll show up. We've had about 30 episodes. The first 8, I think, were just audio strictly, and then since that, we've gone to a video format. Talk about all things bail. We've talked about bail in the movies. We've talked about drug abuse on pretrial, all kinds of different stuff relating to bail. We just spoke with a guy here that just got posted this past week, Kirk Shaw, who wrote a book about bail reform in New Jersey and how New Jersey basically obliterated its bail system and what's going on there. Is crime as good as they say or bad as they say, or as good as they say it is in New Jersey, or is it out of control? And so he gave us a lot of insight as to what happened in New Jersey when they changed their constitution to allow them to let everybody go or preventively detain some people.
My assumption is crime went up under him, right?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Of course.
They claim crime is down, but the Attorney General's office had to form a special task force just to deal with the increase in automobile theft that's happened over the past 3 or 4 years. So maybe that crime's actually up and people are just not reporting it, other than on mandatory reporting crimes like a car theft. If your car gets stolen, your insurance isn't going to pay for it unless you make a police report. So those things get reported, whereas some other minor crime that you don't think the police are going to do anything on, maybe you don't make that report. And so the numbers look lower than they actually are.
Well, let's assume that our audience knows nothing about bail because they've never been in jail before. You want to just give a brief description of what bail is for and who uses it? Who are your customers?
Well, the easiest way to say that is probably if you get arrested for a criminal charge, say DUI is probably an easy way to talk about this. You get stopped for a DUI, and for whatever reason, the police or the court think that you might be a risk to not appear. The court can then require you to give some sort of assurance that you will be back in court. And obviously, most of the time that takes the form of some sort of monetary assurance. Say you get stopped for a DUI. I know in California, the DUI bonds are ridiculously high, but here your bond might be $1,000 or $1,500. If you don't have that money in your pocket, or you can't call your significant other to say, hey, baby, come, please bring me down $1,000, get me out of here. you can call a bonding company, and the bonding company will typically post that bond and take that liability for you for a fee, typically 10% of the bond. So if you had a $1,500 bond, the bonding company might charge you $150. They would then guarantee that you will either make it to court, or they will make sure that $1,500 gets paid, or in the alternative, you will return that person to court. That's where the whole bounty hunter mythos comes from, is if a person misses court on a bonding company, the bonding company can place you back into custody to then relieve their potential liability. But bond is simply to guarantee that you'll show up for court to answer the charges against you. And oftentimes the court determines you don't need a bond. You've lived in this
Mhm.
community forever. I think you're probably okay. We'll just let you sign a promise to appear. And as long as you go to court, you're fine. If you don't show up for court, well, then they're going to issue a warrant for you, and you'll probably have a bond associated with that warrant that for future court appearances, since you've already missed, we're going to make you give some real assurance that you'll be back in court.
Well, there are some jurisdictions that sometimes give really high bails, partially because they see the person as a threat to the community as well, right? So bail can be used that way to keep it, because the higher the bail is, if they got to put their mama's house up as collateral to get out, then they're less likely to commit that violent crime. So talk a little bit about that dynamic as it relates to bail.
Not every state has a public safety component in setting bond. New York, for instance, they've never actually put anything in the statute that says the court can consider public safety risk. Virtually every other state, though, has some sort of consideration that the court is supposed to take. What is the likelihood you're going to commit a new crime while you're on bond? What's the likelihood you're going to threaten the victim as well, or anybody associated with that? So there is a public safety consideration. In Kansas, there's 13 different factors, and I won't go over all 13 of them, but there's 13 different factors that the court is supposed to take into account when they're determining the bond amount and the conditions of the bond. And those things are public safety risk, victim risk, history of appearance. I won't list all 13. Whether you're in the country
Yeah.
legally, those sorts of things. If you're not here legally, then obviously you're a much higher risk to flee or to fail to appear. And so the court can take all those factors into consideration and kind of amalgamate those all into a dollar figure and conditions that you are required to follow. It could be some sort of electronic monitoring. It could be reporting. You've got to be at home at a certain time. You've got to go take drug screens. Lots of different things the courts can order. Not every state has those, but most of them do have a public safety component in the bond setting decision.
Before we get into our what I want to talk about, charitable, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, and that's a zero bond movement, I guess. So they pretty much throw all that risk factors out and just let everybody out. Can you talk briefly about that?
And that's been done multiple different ways in various states. In New Jersey, which we just referenced, and in New Mexico, they both altered their constitution to allow the state to preventively detain a certain portion of people. And that sort of mirrors the federal system. So if you get arrested for a federal charge, if a federal judge makes a determination that there's no amount or conditions or combination of conditions that will be sufficient to make sure that you'll show up for court and to assure the public safety, they can hold you without bail. And when that was passed, that followed the Salerno case in 1984. Fat Tony Salerno, who was,
Yeah.
I forget which crime family he was part of, but one of the New York
The
mafia families.
yeah.
He challenged that. And so the Salerno case now is the one that makes the determination that the U.S. Constitution provides a right to non-excessive bail, but not a right to being held without bail, which is sort of the Supreme Court splitting the baby. Most of the states do not have that exact same language. Most of the states have a constitutional aspect of bail that says you shall be bailable by sufficient solvent sureties, except in capital cases. So states that want to do away with that have had to go back through and change their constitutions to allow the state to detain you based on lots of different factors, either your flight risk factor or your risk of harm to the community. What New Jersey and New Mexico both did was they adopted a risk algorithm called the Public Safety Assessment that was created by the Arnold Foundation, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a private, I guess, secure. Anyway, you can't see the guts of how the algorithm works, but you ask 4 or 5 questions and check the boxes on them, and then a score kicks out the other end. If that score is high, well, then you can make an argument for preventive detention. If that score is low, well, then you're just automatically released without having to give any sort of assurance that you'll show up for court.
I did look at there's Arnold, and I want to say there was another one, Ventura. I can't think of the other one. I was involved in the bail reform effort early on in LA County, and we were looking at static tools to use. But as soon as we got in a discussion with all right, I lean right? So I'm a moderate Republican, and I'm in this room with all these folks, and I don't know how I got into these projects, but I did. I had to work with Kamala Harris on anti-recidivism programs. It's just, I was the guy they sent to work on this stuff, and they all wanted to, the lefties in the room all wanted to tweak the algorithm. And it's like, well, I mean, if they're coming up with a threat assessment algorithm that's supposed to work, why would you want to tweak it? Well, because it's not there's not equitable. I go, well, it's not about equity. It's about whether they'll show up in court or they're a threat to others. I mean, that's what it's all about. And so I question these tools because there was a lot of pressure to tweak the algorithm, and the fact that they won't share it is concerning. And I did always feel, well, if you have a problem with the algorithm, I said it in the room, then the way to deal with it is you find ways to reduce failures to peer and those types of things, so that you play with the inputs for the algorithm. You don't change the algorithm, meaning you find ways to encourage people to come to court. Anyway, so that's it concerns me because because then it gives, if they tweak the algorithm, don't show it to you, it gives you the perception of fairness. It gives you the perception that they're going to show up in court, and the perception that you've done a risk assessment, but you really haven't because they tweaked the algorithm. So it's interesting that you said they won't show you the algorithm. Is that kind of how you see it too?
It is, but also the Pretrial Justice Institute, which has been an anti-bail group that's on a national scale for a long time, they were all in for pretrial risk assessments. They thought they were the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they were going to be the solution to the evils of people like me. About 4 years ago,
Hmm.
suddenly they decided that, oh, wait a second. When they started doing some math on it, some other people, the ACLU and some other people started looking at that, go, well, this is garbage in, garbage out sort of data, and that
Yeah.
the risk assessments themselves were inherently racist. And
That's exactly what they said in the room when I was there, right?
right,
Exactly. So as soon as you develop the tool, they said, well, the inputs are bad. Well, and yet they control the inputs. I mean, that is the crazy part of it. I mean, they control the government, they control the inputs, they pass the legislation on how we would track stuff, and then they decide, oh no, we're not going to do that. And the funny thing in LA is, I started in LA in '83, so and I started working the streets in '85 because I worked for the sheriff's. I have to work in the jails a little bit. And from '85 moving forward, we cited out most of our low-level misdemeanors,
sure.
which created a high level of failures to appear, and the higher number of failures to appear in these algorithms showed that you were a high risk, and so you could, you had to either have higher bail or no bail depending on the charge, right? And so they created this situation, and then they don't like the situation when you start doing these static tools, which is crazy to me. But hey, you heard an article. The article that we led with was a charitable bond fund letting a guy out, and he went to commit murder. And this was in Indiana. I think it was Indiana. So. Let's give us the brief history of the charitable bail funds and how long they've been around, and just tell us about it.
Well, it sort of depends on who you ask. The charitable bail funds themselves would like to latch onto this longer lineage of sort of community of mutual aid groups that have been done in the past. So if you go to the Bail Project, which is the subject of that particular article, if you go to their website, they'll have a 5 or 6 page history of charitable bail or of bail funds in the United States, and they reference things like the ACLU bail fund in the 1920s that was established to help post bail for, in all honesty, for communists during
Mhm.
the Red Scare of the 1920s. And one of the interesting things there was that bail fund ultimately ended up posting bond after some labor dispute. They ended up posting $40,000 worth of bonds for, I think, 5 defendants. Um, and think of the 1920s, how high
That
$40,000 was.
that's a lot of money. Yeah.
That is a lot of money back then. And so, but what happened was that the leader of the group, George Beale, fled the country and went to Russia. And the bail fund, the ACLU bail fund, ended up having to eat it for $28,500 because he was the bulk of all the bonds that were there. And that was sort of the death knell of that particular bail fund. It sort of limped along, but most of their assets got lost in that. And then in the late 40s, early 50s, there was another bail fund that started up similar to that. It was the CRC. It meant something else, but basically it was there to support, again, during the Red Scare of the 50s, communists who were charged with that. And so they ended up charging 11 different people over some other dispute, and they posted $260,000 in those bonds. But five, I think, four or five of the 11 defendants that were charged, again, fled the country and didn't come back because "Well, it's not my money. I don't care." And then later on, in the 1960s, Eldridge Cleaver, there was a bail fund that was devoted strictly to bonding out Eldridge Cleaver. And they managed to get this all put together and post $50,000 in cash and got Eldridge Cleaver out. He was the leader of the Black Panthers.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he's not in the country because he, just the same as the other ones, fled the country, never saw him again. But other than I guess, to be insulting, the communist aspect of the bail fund part of it, those groups don't really have any relationship to what we have now as the modern charitable bail fund. The modern charitable bail fund, it generally solicits donations, and they essentially, their goal here is not, we want to help particular people out, we want to help particular crimes out, we want to address people that are being charged with free speech violations or whatever. They want to break the system. I mean, they actually call themselves bail disruptors. What they're trying to do is post these bonds and demonstrate that bonds not necessary. And so they'll go through and they'll gather up enough money and they'll post bonds. But for the most part, people weren't really all that interested until one particular event, and I'm sure we'll talk about that,
Yeah.
in
Hmm.
sending a lot of money to these, because it's like, these people are criminals. I don't want my money to go getting criminals out of jail. Hell, they might rob me next week. And so you didn't see a lot of that. So what you had, you had these bail funds that were truly small operations that were helping the indigent and were trying to post bail for, if you got stopped for a traffic ticket and you missed court and you had a $300 bond and you couldn't get out, I'm going to lose my job if you don't help me. And they would come post those bonds, like the Minnesota Freedom Fund, for instance, that Kamala Harris plugged. Um, Prior to 2020, their average bond, I think, was $350 to $400. They were getting donations of about maybe $10,000 a month. So there's not a whole lot of bonds you can post in full cash for $10,000 a month, even if your average bond is $500. That's only like 20 people. And so you go through and you're pretty selective about who you get out. If there's a hardship story, I've got to get, this person, I'm going to lose my job, please help me out. And so a lot of these bail funds were like that. But anymore, the bail funds now are just, we want to break the system. They got a whole bunch of money in, and now they just start bonding out anybody with the idea that they're going to show that cash bail doesn't work. And if cash bail doesn't work, we'll put ourselves out of business, and the government will have to find some other way to do this pretrial release.
Yeah, one of the things they talked about, I mean, I worked with the Center for Court Innovation out in New York on some projects. They talk about, okay, we'll release them and then we'll give them programming while they're out, and that'll work. I did oversee the leg alarm things. I forget what they call them now, but where you're kind of tethered to your home, right? I had a unit that would go out and round those guys up, but there was still a certain amount of risk assessment that we did on who we allowed to go in those programs, and it appears like these charitable bond funds have zero risk assessment, which hopefully we'll get into in a minute here. But I think we got to talk about the one thing that everybody says, um, and we got to talk about that. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you should be stuck in jail, and that's really not. We let a lot of people out in LA. It wasn't just about money. In fact, it was a misdemeanor, nonviolent misdemeanor, and you had good ID, we knew who you were. Just about everybody got released in California. Now, I found when I started working on these projects, that wasn't necessarily the case around the country. But there were a lot of poor working folks, and then we always had this opportunity. If we gave you bail, meaning we said, okay, your bail is $5,000, you could still call up a judge and they do an assessment and determine if you could be released on your own recognizance. So there was still some kind of judicial review. So all of this stuff existed even before this bail reform movement. And is that consistent around the country too? Some form variations exist around the country like that?
Yeah, and I think even more so now. I mean, there's the bail reform. You start off in the form of these lawsuits probably in 2015 when you started really seeing these influxes. There was an activist group called, it was at the time it was called Equal Justice Under the Law, and they would go pick out small cities that couldn't really defend themselves, and they'd file lawsuits against them based on their bail programs. And if you have a city, I mean, most people don't realize this, but if you as a government agency get sued for a civil rights violation, you can't recover those attorney's fees, regardless of how frivolous that case might be. If it's a civil rights claim, then you can't get attorney's fees from the losing side. Whereas if you just sued somebody who was completely frivolous, I mean, the American rule is you don't generally don't get attorney's fees anyway. But to prevent you from filing completely frivolous cases, the court can always order that. You can't do that in civil rights cases. So if you sue a city and suddenly that city has to go to federal court and they're going to spend $400,000, $500,000 in attorney's fees to try and defend their municipal bail system that handles 5,000 cases a year, well, we'll just settle this. Go away, and yeah, we'll let everybody go. We'll find out some other way to do it because we can't afford this. A traffic light cost $150,000 to install. I can't go and spend, $500,000 in a big firm to go federal court and defend us. And so the plan was to essentially get enough of these cases to where you could go and go, look, all these cases have been done here, and then start going to bigger jurisdictions and say, well, we're going to sue you too. And so, look, these other places, they all lost, even though they weren't actual adversarial decisions. But because of that, a lot of places are much more aware of the things that they need to do to stay in line. Some of the claims that were made were legitimate claims. I think it was Clanton, Alabama. I forget the case. They sued that city. It was a small city. The judge was only in once every week and a half or 2 weeks. You got arrested for that. It was going to be 2 weeks before you saw a judge to even have a chance to have anybody review that. And so there's a pretty good argument that that's probably a constitutional violation. That's probably a due process violation because you're not being given the opportunity to have a judge adjudicate what's going on. They're just taking it off a bail schedule and going, well, I guess your next chance to sit here is, 2 weeks from
Yeah.
now, post bond or else. And so I think a lot of places, in response to this litigation, have modified their behavior on that. They'll get people in a whole lot faster than they did before. You generally don't see jurisdictions where people languish there for weeks before they would see a judge. Generally, it's within the next 48 hours, depending on whether there's a Sunday or something like that that's involved. But you're getting in front of that judge in pretty quickly in court days, so the judge can then make a determination. Okay, are you indigent? Does that indigency justify letting you go? Are there other factors that go, it doesn't matter that you're indigent, you have 10 failure to appears on your record, and you just threatened to kill the victim here, we're still going to make you post some sort of bond. So, but that takes away the due process concerns there, because a judge has reviewed your case, has looked at the situation, and has made a determination.
Yeah, it's and good for that. That seems outrageous that that was going on for so long. But even in the big jurisdictions like Los Angeles, I mean, we've been flooded with leftist politicians who embrace every idea without any because the way I look at it is, hey, I need evidence. Give me evidence to show that this works, and I'm willing to try something. And although I lean right and I'm a Republican, I do have this progressive streak where I would like good government, and if we can get better outcomes, I'm willing to pilot something and try something. But I don't want to do it. I always say ideology never makes for good public policy. Well, let's throw up a couple of headlines. See, we got one from the Washington Examiner, and this is Kamala Harris urged bail fund donations from uh, let's see, urged bail from front lines during the 2020 riots, and then we got her Twitter feed where she urged it, and this is for the Minnesota Freedom Fund, and here she is. If you are able to chip in now to the Minnesota Freedom Fund to help post bail for those protesting on the ground in Minnesota, okay, you can take those down. So the thing that's outrageous, I did read up on this. The fund only really had a couple 100,000 in it, so they, like you said, they only did they they assessed it, they took risks, they applied their resources to the most needy and where they can have the most help. But they got all these donations, $41 million,
Yeah.
and then they started just bonding everybody out. And of course, Harris is running away from this. So can you talk about the event, the George Floyd event, and how that just put these bond funds, these charitable bail funds, on steroids because they got so much money?
Sure. George Floyd has been the seminal event in criminal justice, quite frankly, in the past 20 years. I mean, it is as bad as it all happened. We all watched the videos. We all saw and we were all told that this was emblematic of the way that black people were treated by the police, black men and in particular. And it
Yeah.
was implied with the media coverage that, there were thousands of unarmed black men being murdered by the police,
Yeah.
every year. And it's like when, and if you tried to say, hey, wait a second, here's this Washington Post study that shows it's like 10, per year. And there's extenuating circumstances in all of those. Oh, no, you were just now, a horrible racist for even pointing out facts. Those facts became propaganda. But Americans saw those videos. They don't understand. I think Heather McDonald said, police resistance is never pretty, I think was the language that she used on that. And, so you see those things and it's something that's out of your experience, like, and you feel really bad for it. And we've got our phones and we've got our PayPal and we've got everything else where we can donate to the latest Caribbean hurricane. This was just the next Caribbean hurricane. I feel bad about this. I will feel better if I send some money to assuage, my concerns about this. And so these groups, the Bail Project and the Minnesota Freedom Fund, largely because the protests were taking place in Minnesota and because she was Senator Harris at the time, promoted that fund on her Twitter page. And you had a couple, three other celebrities. Justin Timberlake, I think, was one of them. Kind of ironic. He got picked up for a DUI here not long ago. But
Yeah.
so you had some celebrities that promoted that. And so all this money came pouring into the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Almost an equal amount of money came into the Bail Project, though. But they have offices spread out all over the country. And so that was spread out more places. So you went from just being, well, we're going to help particularly needy people to, well, we're going to help anybody we can to break the system. And Minnesota Freedom Fund, I mean, the Bail Project, considering they're in more places, has more of those horror stories like the one that you posted before. I mean, they've got 3 or 4 other murder cases, in Indiana. They've got a killing in Kentucky that also basically a person stole a vehicle and they bonded him out because he was in a stolen vehicle intoxicated. And 6 days later, he was back in another stolen vehicle intoxicated and hit a 17-year-old girl, and she died in the process. In St. Louis, which was the one that I followed the most closely, because the pretrial justice task force here in Kansas a few years ago was visiting with the Bail Project in St. Louis. And this was before that, but they bonded out a guy that for a domestic violence case. And, as soon as he walked out of the jail, he went home and killed his wife. And so, but nobody was bonding him out because of that. I mean, and that's one of the things that people don't really take into consideration. Anyway, I'm getting off a rabbit hole here.
So let me talk a couple of things. So I did some research on this. So pre George Floyd, they had a couple 100,000, and they would use that to bond people out based upon what you said, based upon a lot of considerations, right? I would say they do their own risk assessment and their own value. What do I get out of this, right? Who are we helping? And I imagine people connected with the fund probably got a little more help than those who weren't. Then post George Floyd, they had $41 million, and they do have some tragedies. They bonded out Christopher Boswell, a 2-time convicted rapist who had pending charges of kidnapping and sexual assault. He went on to commit a murder. They also bonded out another career criminal, George Howard, shot and killed a man in a road rage situation after he was bonded out. So they have a history of bonding out the wrong guys, and they seem unapologetic about it. They say, "Oh well," and that's really where I have why aren't they? They're not required to do any risk assessment on who they bond out. Is that correct?
No, they're not. And one of the things about the Minnesota Freedom Fund, it was not the case in 2020 when Kamala Harris tweeted that out, but it is now. And I think in 2021, they have a new co-executive director who is a convicted murderer who is still on probation until 2025. Now, giving him the benefit, he completely bettered himself in prison. I mean, he finished his high school degree, he got a college degree, he got an IT certification. I mean, he did all the things we expect people to do while they're in prison to come out and do better. But probably not the best place to put somebody who's still on probation is in charge of decision making about who gets out of jail. Nobody else in the system is allowed to be a convicted felon and work in bail bonds, police work, probation, any of the things surrounding the criminal justice system. If you are a convicted felon, you need to go find something else to do.
Well, even if he, well, he of all people, even if he got straight, he knows that the likelihood of people getting straight in prison and jail is small, right?
And
Even though
he
he might,
specifically said 90% of people are back.
right, exactly. I mean, I ran anti-recidivism programs in the LA County jail system, the largest in the country. Actually, I worked on a project with Kamala Harris and her staff. And when you looked at the wraparound services you had to provide for people who are medium to high recidivate, it took a lot of effort. And I'm a nerd when it comes to public policy, so we had quality assurance plan, we fidelity to programming, and we were getting good successes. But to do that in a very bureaucratic organization like the sheriff's department, and to do it and as wide a scale as we need to be to do successful is a challenge. And to do it based on ideology, like I said, when ideologues push it, we ignore all the failures because it makes them feel good that we're just letting people out. That doesn't matter whether they're safe or not. Well, let's get into. I did have, so there are we just talked about the consequences of the bail funds. So they don't have to make, if somebody doesn't show up for their bond, do they lose that money still too, or are they funding insurance to do this? Are they partnering with the bonding agencies at all to do this?
Not really. I've had a couple of bonds over the years, and there have been what would be truly community bail funds that have been helping people out, and they have actually paid the bonding company. So they've paid the bonding company to post the bond. They won't guarantee the bond because normally the bond, when a bonding company does a bond, it's two parts. There's the fee, and then there's
Mhm.
the guarantee. We're always going to require friend, family member, somebody like that that knows the person, that can keep an eye on them, that that is willing to come and take that liability. Because if they're not willing to take that liability, that's the first giant red flag. That
Yes.
person's not going to go to court. They're crazy. They're going to be using it. I want this person to stay in until they get sober. So those people that know that person, they have a degree of control. Now, when a bail fund comes and just posts the bond and walks back out, you're right. But it's the same problem with zero bail. Is that zero bail? You just let somebody go. If you have a bail fund, in theory, that bail fund is doing that. But no, if they post the cash bond and if the jurisdiction they're working on is doing what they're supposed to do, after a period of time, and that period of time varies by state, there should be a judgment granted against that bond, and that cash should go into wherever it goes. Some places it goes to schools, some places it goes to the state's general fund, but they should lose that money because of that failure to appear. And their argument is, well, you can put this money in and it'll cycle back over because we'll get this money back when the case is done. And the bail project tries to make the claim that it has a 90% plus appearance rate. So most of that money is all coming back to recycle again. But those are their numbers. And so if you look at separate evaluations, CNN did a study where they looked at Indianapolis Bail Fund, the bail project. We're showing a failure to appear rate in the neighborhood of 42%. And I think the Minnesota Freedom Fund over a period of time had a failure to appear rate in 53%. And the bail project in Oklahoma, there was another news article where their failure to appear rate, between failure to appears and rearrest, it was 53% of people had either missed court or gotten rearrested on there. But now if you have $42 million, you don't have to recycle that money just as often. You can get people out and lose the money because you've got tens of millions of dollars sitting there that you don't have to worry about. As opposed to a bonding company, it's like, if I lose a $10,000 bond, that's coming out of my pocket.
Okay.
First and foremost, if I can collect back from the family or whatever, that's great, but the court doesn't care. So I have to be extra careful about who I post bond for and what conditions I get them out under, because I have direct liability. I don't have a $42 million nest egg out there where I can bond out anybody that moves.
And that's what we're talking about. They don't have the liability, and of course, they have a Rolodex of donors in the past that they could tap
Sure.
into now because they got $41 million. But we do have states that are trying to legislate this, right? And so let's talk about it. Like Georgia, I think is, Kentucky is. What do you see is on the horizon for legislating these charitable bail funds?
I think you're going to see a lot more restrictions on them because, I did a podcast with Kim Ogg here a couple, 3 months ago. And one of the things she talked about was you don't want to be the one holding the bag when, the triple murder happens. You don't want to be the guy
Yep.
that has that person on bond. You don't want to be anywhere associated with that at all. Because when that happens, then the legislature feels like, and the politicians feel like, we have to do something about this. And if the news media is doing, if you just Google charitable bail murder, you'll get page after page after page of stories. Now, some of them are repeats, but there's still a bunch of people that have been bonded out and have gone on to commit other violent crimes on these bond form these charitable bail funds. So New York made some changes and basically limited you can't do felonies and it can only be nonviolent misdemeanors and your max bail is 2,000. I know they've done that. Tennessee, I know it was considering. I don't know if it made it through. Was considering simply banning charitable bail,
Hmm.
altogether. You couldn't do charitable bail there. Um, you mentioned Georgia, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But Indiana did a similar thing to Georgia, where they put some restrictions on who you could post bond for. One of the things that Indiana put the restriction on was you had to be an Indiana resident,
Hmm.
and the bail project, it was really talking out of both sides of his mouth on that issue because their argument was, well, we're part of the community, and us being part of the community makes it that way we can do a better job of supervising people because we're in the community. But hey, you shouldn't make us be required to live in the state of Indiana. It's like, well, you can't really be part of the community and not
Yeah.
be in the local community. Um, Now, the ACLU, on behalf of the bail project, sued the state of Indiana in federal court and claimed that this was a free speech violation. That this was posting of bail was expressive behavior, and they should be allowed to do that. And the state, was violating the First Amendment by not allowing them to express themselves in this manner. And the circuit or the appellate court said, yeah, no, this is not expressive behavior. Now, it was a 2-3 decision at the deal. And so there was a dissent on that. And so when Georgia passed their law, they sued and made the same claims. Oh, you're impacting us here. This is expression, this behavior. And so what they tried to modify that says, well, we have Black Mama's bailout night. And so when we go to post those bonds, we'll have a whole group of people waiting outside the jail to greet those people. And so that's expressive behavior that goes along with our posting bail. And so that means this is all under the First Amendment, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that if you bring a crowd with you, it's First Amendment. If you don't bring a crowd with you, it's not. But the judge there, who, I mean, is a recent Biden appointee, quoted the dissent in the Indiana case. And so the state of Georgia has filed an interlocutory appeal, and they're going to try and see what the 11th Circuit has to say as to whether or not that actually is free speech, or if the state has a vested interest in regulating who's getting people out on these pretrial release bonds. My assumption is that ultimately they'll come down on the side that the state has an interest in this, because that's been all the case law. The state absolutely has an interest in this. They have an interest in regulating how this occurs. That's why they have an interest in regulating bail bondsmen themselves. And I think this will fall in that same area. How much it gets into, I don't know. It really depends on the legislature and the state and people. But I think that the public itself, given the increases in crime we've seen with zero bail, I don't think they're enamored as much about this as they used to be.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I just wrote a few things down. We only got 1 minute to go, and we're going to
Oh,
wrap
okay.
here. But reporting, registration, set maximum amounts, which you kind of talked about, that could be covered by the fund in terms of bonding out, and limits the number of times you can bond a particular person out to a certain amount. I guess probably for a year, because we get these repeat offenders, right? So. But hey, thank you for coming on my show. It's been very, very educational. I think most of the public does not even understand most of this stuff, which is why I like doing the show on these kind of subjects. And I definitely wanted to cover it because I'll market it so that people go, well, what is charitable bond funds and what actually did Kamala Harris do? And we did address that on the show. So I appreciate you pitch hitting for Jeff Clayton, and you did a fantastic job. And hey, if you ever need me to step on and talk about what's going on in California, I'll be glad to do that on your show
All
as
right, go
well.
great. I would love the reciprocity.
Okay, so thank you for joining us. And you know what? This is Briefing with the Chief every Wednesday, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Shane, our producers, would like to talk to you after the show. Just stick around a little bit. And Amanda, you can take it away.